welcome to the Law, Your Money, and You. I'm Mylan Saphire.
And thank you. That was my granddaughter, Madeline Saphire. She's in training, and we welcome you. And I'm Roberta Saphire. I'm an attorney in Sharon.
And I'm Camille Barron, a financial coordinator also in Sharon. And we have, I don't know how many times now it's been, by overwhelming demand, a guest who's very special to us. And she is visiting us again today for a return engagement.
Yeah, she's very special to the town of Sharon. She is on the school committee for 100 years.
Or
and
6,
she's
give or take.
Summa cum laude and brilliant, and she's expertise in this area of the law as well as several other areas. We welcome once again Emily Smith-Lee. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
it's great to
give
be
us
here.
a little background, very little because everybody pretty well knows you by now, but for the upper comings, tell us a little
Sure.
bit and we'll get right into this important subject, new subject.
Certainly. So by way of background, I live here in Sharon. I've got 2 children, one still in the school system, one in college. I have a law practice in the center of town, and one of my areas of focus is employment law, which
But
is
it
what
does
we're here to talk about.
not just in Massachusetts, but we can have this for the rest of the country, the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
They all
Absolutely.
have,
'Cause-
people all have this similar situation.
Yep. Yep.
So what's
So that was
new?
my brief.
Tell us what's new in employment law, because every time you visit with us, there's always something new.
There is. And the big new thing that I came to talk about is the change in the Department of Labor regulations for this is a mouthful, Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, commonly known to the rest of us normal human beings as the overtime laws.
Okay.
And
Overtime what?
overtime laws.
Oh, overtime
Overtime
laws.
laws.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So anyone who has any employees at all needs to be aware of this, right?
That's right.
Whether it's
That's
a
right.
huge company or a staff of one.
Our workers.
Yep.
Who's more interested, the employers or the employees in this new law?
Both, honestly. I mean, people use the term game changer for a lot of things, but this really kind of is.
How is that?
So the basics of overtime law is unless you're exempt, if your employees work more than 40 hours a week, they need to be paid time and a half for all of those extra hours. So if you make $10 an hour and work 50 hours a week, you're supposed to get paid $10 an hour for 40 hours and $15 an hour.
Well, what's exempt
extra.
now?
That's where we're going.
That's the key thing. I'm looking
So
for-
historically, there have been 2 tests for whether your worker is exempt. One is called the salary test, and to leave a lot of the extra detail out, it basically means you make a certain amount of money.
Yeah.
And then if you make a certain amount of money, there's what's known as the duties test.
And may I interject one thing? Is the certain amount of money universal, or does it depend on each employer's rules?
Nope, universal. So for 20 some odd years, the certain amount of money has been $450 a week, which if you're in Massachusetts is essentially minimum wage. Anybody making more than that could potentially be considered exempt. So the other test, the duties test, entire forests have been killed by lawyers writing briefs and judges writing opinions about that. It's about as clear as mud and subject of a totally different discussion. But what the Department of Labor has changed is the 450 threshold, or 455. It was the annual equivalent of about $23,000 a year. It's doubled.
Oh.
So the salary test, you have to be making more than the annual equivalent of $47,000 a year
Really?
to be considered exempt.
Oh.
So if somebody doesn't make $47,000 and they're salaried, they have to be paid.
Whether they're the
Overtime.
president of the company or the janitor, it doesn't matter what they do all day. If they don't make that threshold, they have to be paid overtime.
So a president of a company, what if you own the company? Do you have to be paid overtime too? Because then you pay more in
Yeah.
Social Security, right?
If you own the company, you are in a sort of different category because you're not an
Oh,
employee.
okay. All
But
right.
But if you're a high-level person in the company who otherwise would be exempt from overtime, if you're under that threshold, you have to be paid overtime.
So if you make 50,000 a year, you can be exempt?
If you meet the duties test, yes.
Oh,
But if you make now $40,000 a year, even if you were to meet the duties test, you have to be paid overtime. So the other kind of game changer of it is one of the reasons it's gotten so out of whack is that it hasn't been adjusted for inflation in decades. It's now going to automatically change every 3 years.
According to what?
According to an index of the, I forget the numbers, I think it's a quartile of
what, and go up?
annual salary.
Go
It'll
up?
go up. If wages go up, it'll go up. If wages go down, it'll go down.
And the duties test, did you mention that?
Yes. The duties test, there's, and I'm going to try to not get too far into the weeds here,
Okay.
an administrative, a professional, and an executive exemption. And in each of those categories, you look at what people do all day. So, for example, there's been a lot of litigation about assistant store managers in large retail chains who have the title manager, but what they actually do all day isn't necessarily managerial.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
where
they might do sales, but
They
they
might
call
sp-
them manager.
exactly they might spend a majority of their time, restocking shelves and running the cash register.
Oh, so
That's-
they're going to ask what the duties are instead of just taking a name that this one is a supervisor. They're going to say, well, what do you do?
Yes.
Is
No,
that
that's
what
always been true, though.
Oh, it is?
That's always been how they look at the duties test, if that makes sense. But the thing that's so dramatic about this is you don't even get to the duties test.
Yeah.
So, Roberta, you asked who cares about this, who's most interested, employers or employees? I think both. I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think so.
it's an incredible broadening of the number of people, employees, workers, who should be entitled to some extra compensation for overtime. I suspect that's going to make an enormous difference in a lot of people's lives. From the employer's perspective, they've got a much higher bar to overcome to have people working more than 40 hours without paying them. And the fact that it's going to change every 3 years.
Yeah.
This is going to be easy for a big company with an in-house legal department who does annual updates about what it is you should look for. I think a lot of small businesses who don't have that may be caught by surprise.
So the employer who has these people who have been in that gap between what was and what is, somebody maybe 35,000 a year,
Yeah.
and this person has worked some weeks 45 hours, 50 hours, is the employer required no matter what? Like if the employee says, you don't have to pay me overtime, it doesn't matter, they still have to get overtime, time and a half.
Yes, but not going backwards. So the new regulations go into effect December 1st. So as of December 1st, employers have to follow these rules for people working 40 hours or more thereafter.
December 1st, 2016. It'll be interesting to come back next year and see what it is. Now I have a question. Now for the small business, say you have 5, 6 employees and nobody punches in and out and they work 50 hours, but they go off to do errands and things like that when they're not working. So what's going to happen there?
So it's a great question. So first, from the federal overtime perspective, there is a little bit of protection for very small businesses. If you do less than $500,000 in revenue a year and you don't do anything interstate, you got to worry about Massachusetts, but you don't have to worry about the federal law. But more importantly, whatever size you are, if you're not keeping track of time, the burden ends up falling on the employer if an employee raises an issue to establish what their hours were. So if you're not punching clocks or if you're not documenting that, Camille went out for a 2-hour meeting with her sister on Monday, and even though she stayed till 6 that night, it's a tough road for the employers to demonstrate that in fact all that time was taken.
There is what you call the game changer. There's a lot, because people who don't punch in and out, you're going to have to get them to punch in and out.
Yeah.
Or keep records. In some, it doesn't have to be a time clock, But, if your office hours are 9 to 5 and nobody is usually there after that, you can kind of assume that people show up to work at 9 and leave at 5. But if you've got people working weekends, if you've got people working into the evenings, yeah, you want to document it somehow. Well, part-time is less of an issue because part-time typically doesn't go over 40 hours.
Oh.
Right.
However, if you have someone who's committed to working 30 hours and they work, in some cases, they might really work 40 hours, they're working over and above what they are supposed to be. Does that apply to them at all? No.
No, it's a straight 40. You could have a contract, and many people with unions do, that says you get overtime for over your agreed amount, but from the law's perspective, it's 40.
Okay.
Now, 40 hours, what if it's over 40 just 1 week out of 2 months? It still applies?
For that 1 week.
Okay, now here's another question that I didn't tell anybody I was going to ask, but I thought of it because it came up today. Might be a new case for you.
There you go.
You have a chain of beauty parlors. I'm going to pick beauty parlors. You have a chain of beauty parlors. They have 3 or 4 beauty parlors, and they have, your managers. And then you have your assistant manager, and the manager can't be everywhere. So the assistant manager goes from this place to that place to this place, and there are 4 different businesses, but they're owned by the same people.
Oh.
Do you know the question that I'm about to ask?
I think I do, but go for it.
Yeah. Now, the person works, typically a girl, would work more than 40 hours because she's got to do this, she's got to do that. She's not supposed to, but invariably she ends up, and she gets, in this case, 2 separate paychecks, one for this and company and one for the other company. But meanwhile, she's working for basically the same people. They just have different companies. I would think that
it's an interesting question because, if you work for truly 2 different companies, 25 hours a week for one and 25 hours a week for the second, that doesn't count typically to overtime. However, but they're owned and controlled by the same person, and if that's set up that way in order to avoid the overtime requirements.
Well, there's the reason.
Okay.
The reason, usually, it could be, I don't think it's not intended to set up to avoid. It just so happens that way. You set up different businesses for liability. So if somebody falls on this property, it's not in the same name as this property. It's protection. But then you have that. Now, and then also, what if they perform 2 absolutely different? If they perform 2 absolutely different jobs, I think there's still a problem. Or there used to be. I don't know if it changed. But I mean, isn't that? So there's your 40 hour. What happens there?
I think
there's a lot of people out there.
Yeah. No, I think that would end up falling into the bucket of whether they were truly separate entities or not. There are times under the law when you can do what's called piercing the corporate veil. If people have nominally different companies, but there's not a lot of documentation and they're not observing formalities, you'd have to be able to consider those 2 companies one employer, though, for that to be an overtime problem.
So that's potentially a court case, right? Because it's a matter of interpretation sometimes?
Yes. Yes.
There's probably more of those than anything else. Every law that there is, there's always all these gray areas.
Yeah, the people are always trying to get around it. I was talking to this young lady today, and she said, I said, I think you got something there. She says, well, my cousin still works there. I don't want to do it. I said, boy, they got you good. But she said she used to do the work. She was supposed to do this, but they had her doing managerial work.
Okay.
Her title was something else, but she was doing, the owner was doing. I mean, isn't that something? You can think so in beauty parlors. But,
right. Well, you know what it reminds me of? When the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010,
Okay, tell our viewers what the
Oh,
affordable care
it's
is.
known as
There you
Obamacare,
go.
and one of the requirements of that is that insurance is mandatory, and if someone doesn't have insurance, they have to pay a fine. So that means that employers,
Who pays the fine? The person.
the person,
Right.
so employers with 50 or more employees are required to provide insurance for their employees.
Somebody told me that if you have a lot of part-time people, and if it adds up to a certain amount of hours, that they can be considered having to have mandatory. Is that so?
I don't know if that's
I think
so.
the 50, in most places that have a number of employee cap, it's usually calculated on a full-time equivalent basis. So if you have 50 human beings and they all work 20 hours a week, you may not have 50 people.
Oh.
But the other requirement is the person has to work 30 hours a week or more in order to be subject to that. So we started to see some employers cutting back on hours of some employees to under 30 hours a week so that they wouldn't have to be responsible for the insurance. And now I just wonder, Emily, if there'll be repercussions even with this type of a law where somebody, maybe an employer who might not be inclined to pay this time and a half,
Yep.
might find ways to be sort of out of that, and maybe we'd see something like.
Well, they might have to stay alive. You know, the government can have trillions in debt and keep running, but if a business has half that, not even half that, they wouldn't even get that far. I mean, they're out of business. So what do you think the businesses will do?
So I think to the first question, can they sort of game the system in the way that businesses could game the Affordable Care Act system? You know, not so much, because in order to keep their employees considered exempt, they have to raise their pay. You know, that's not an easy thing to do. That's not a free thing to do. One thing they could do is organize their employees so that people are not typically working 40 hours a week. Therefore, if they've got to work a little extra. So that's a sort of a form of what you're talking about. But I think there's not a lot of easy answers for small businesses. It's, you know, on the one hand, you could look at it as a crushing blow. On the other hand, you could look at it and say, you know, a family of 3, the poverty line is $23,000. Under the old rules, you had to basically be earning at the poverty line to be eligible for overtime. And is that sustainable for the middle class? Is that sustainable for employees?
So there's no exemptions around there, and no volunteer. Can the person do volunteer? Can they volunteer to work? Volunteer,
No.
I'm coming in on my day off.
No, because then you have a minimum wage violation.
Gee, I remember when I worked for this lawyer, I used to come in on Saturdays and Sundays to catch up. I never asked
Well, no,
for
you can do that.
anything.
You can have people come in on Saturdays and Sundays and work extra time and not pay them any extra money as long as they're making at least $47,000 a year. Or the equivalent per week. It's
I
$900.
got
Which would make them exempt,
I got
right?
$85
It would make them-
a week.
It used to be $400.
That was
Yes.
good back then. $85 a week.
You're either dating yourself
I am-
or
I am
your
dating
employer was
myself.
violating the law.
It was in another life. The Subway was a nickel and a tuna fish sandwich was 35 cents.
So there's one other new thing,
Yes.
which
years
your
ago.
question reminded me. The Earned Sick Leave Act that went into effect this summer in Massachusetts, all employers, regardless of size, have to allow employees to accrue up to 40 hours of paid sick leave.
Sick leave?
Sick leave, as in sick days. But importantly, it's not just for sick time. People are entitled to use it to take their kids to the doctor, to deal with other family health-related things. And the employers are not allowed to retaliate against them for using it.
Really?
They get paid for that? I mean, they get paid?
They
for
earn
sick
up
time?
to 40, up to basically a week's worth of sick
Okay,
time.
let me ask a question on that. Joey comes into work at 10 and he's got his sick leave, and at 12 noon he says, I gotta go take my kids. He gets paid for the whole day, or does half of that day go for sick time, or is there a way?
So if he's leaving at 12 to go take his kids to a doctor, those hours that he's gone to take his kids to the doctor can be paid up to 40 hours a year.
Oh, okay, that's what you do.
If he's just going to pick up his kids from school, no.
Now, I remember that salary thing. I had this girl, and it must have been the first time she was salaried, because she was entitled to an hour lunch, and she was supposed to punch in and out. So what she would do is go out to lunch and be gone for 3 hours, and then say, we'll take an hour off. But there was something, and I think it's still in effect. If you don't go to work that day, it doesn't matter that you're salaried. You don't have to be paid for that day. That was
As
it.
a matter of law, I think that's correct.
Oh, good. I thought you were going to.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I don't think the law, the state or the federal law, has a provision that says you have to pay people for not being at work,
Right.
except for this earned sick time law now.
So that's a new
Which is
thing.
up-
Yeah, she didn't know about that. The payroll service told me. I
Yeah.
said, really? That's great.
Well, here's another question about that.
Yep.
Some companies are replacing sick leave versus vacation with what they call PTO, paid time
Yep.
off. So how would this law that you're talking about fit into that kind of an arrangement?
So they can still do that. They can still do that, and I'm pretty sure there's an express that the law contemplates that, as long as the employer allows the employee to accrue the minimum allowed by.
Okay.
This is unbelievable. This is a whole new thing. I mean,
It
it's
is.
like you can't just run a business. You have to worry about all these extracurricular things. I mean, it's costly.
It's costly. It's
You've got to be
costlier.
kidding.
It's costlier not to worry about
This is a
it.
good.
However.
You've got to be
Right.
kidding.
Yeah, and you know, the impact of a lot of these laws, and I'm going back to the health, a lot of this is really felt more by small businesses than it is the big companies. Because to a small business, like we just said, an amount of money that has to be outlaid for any type of benefit, right? To a big company, it may not be much. It may be a drop in the bucket. But when you take that same rule, that same requirement, and you apply it to a smaller company with resources far
Because a
less.
small company can be 5 million or 10 million, because in today's world, a million is nothing.
Right. So
I mean,
so it's the
considering-
impact is far greater. It's felt much
Right.
more on the part of the smaller businesses.
Do you think there's going to be some type of exemption for a smaller business?
So, I mean, there is not under the earned sick time at all. To the extent that you're not in interstate commerce.
What about baby time off? Is that a separate
maternity
thing?
leave?
Yeah, maternity
That's a whole
leave.
separate thing.
That's a whole separate
And it's
thing?
not, there's no state or federal law that requires that to be paid. It is often required to be given and job protected.
To men too.
I don't know that that's
Isn't it?
required.
I-
But
Family
to,
leave, you mean?
Yeah, or
Family
family leave, she called it.
I
Do you
don't-
know about that?
Well, I've heard. I don't know if it must be the same thing as maternity leave. I'm not sure if it's the same thing, but it does apply if the family leave
Boy,
does.
Emily, Emily's saying, you've got to be kidding. I'm
What
here
are
to
we
talk about the 40-hour law, and you're talking about all that other stuff. The people who work for you, watch now. They're going to say, Emily, you know, I saw you on TV, and you said, and Emily go, you've got to be kidding. You've got to be, oh, you've got to be kidding. You've got to be kidding. We're doing, you've got to be kidding. We just,
There you
this
go.
topic alone, you've got to be kidding. Now, do you think that this will stay as a law, or maybe at the last minute it'll be saying, oh, we changed our mind?
nope, it's in effect. It's coming. Excuse me. Frog in my throat.
Have some more water.
Sure.
There.
But, you know, let me speak to your question about small businesses. Because you're right, there is a cost. It's felt disproportionately, but it's way costlier not to pay attention.
Yeah, costlier.
And
Not
Yeah.
to pay attention.
Yeah.
and as a small business person, you're right. My employees will watch this. They will hold
You'll
me
be
accountable.
surprised who watches the. I had somebody over the house once, and they were sitting there, and they're going, "Hey, that's what happened to me."
Yep.
Right.
So
But at the
Em-
end of the day, the small businesses, what's even costlier to them is employee turnover, not having good, solid staff. And some of these things sound extreme, but little things like letting your employees see the doctor,
Right.
take their kids to the doctor,
Yes. Yeah.
preventive.
are an investment.
It's it's those quote unquote benefits that go above and beyond
We got to
the
wrap up.
go above and
We
beyond
got to
the
wrap up.
monetary
Maddie,
benefits.
Maddie, you want to close the show?
So we want to
This
thank
is
you,
Maddie.
Emily. It's always interesting, and
You're very
we
welcome.
always
Very
learn
nice.
something.
Very nice.
We want to thank you for being here, and ask our viewers if you have any thoughts, any questions about this law or anything
close
else.
to me, honey.
Make sure that you let us hear from you. Send us an email, because remember, this is your show. The law,
law,
your
your
money,
money,
and you.